Do you ever wonder why sometimes things just don't seem to work out in the field and you end up being unhappy with your images?
If that sounds familiar, then stick around because this week we're going to share 5 great tips to help you improve your keeper rate and get the photos you're hoping for.
And be sure to stick around to the end of the video to watch our tweak of the week where we share a great method for you to improve your images. So Glenn, I saw you just come back from somewhere very far north, I think Churchill.
Mhm.
And even in summer, it's pretty cold there, but you decided to actually hop into the ponds, sit in there, freeze your ass off. So why on earth would you be doing that?
Well, that's a good question. And sometimes you have to ask yourself that question when you're in the field, sitting out in the pond in the mud, the stinky mud. But there's a good reason for it. And the reason is that I want to get those engaging portraits. I want to get at eye level with my subjects. And the subjects that I was photographing were small little shorebirds that were walking around, beautiful species of waterfowl, Pacific loons, and things like that. And so I want to get my camera and the camera sensor at eye level with them so that I feel that connection to the image, that I get that beautiful background. So there's a real reason for my madness.
Well, that makes a lot of sense now because being eye level with your subjects can make a huge difference. Because especially for waterfowl, if you're kind of up higher than them shooting down, you get the background right behind them and it usually looks quite unpleasant. Whereas if you're eye level, and especially in an open landscape like the tundra, you can get a beautiful distant background behind it and actually put a lot of depth into your
I
image.
think one of the things, and this is, I guess, our first tip, and sort of one of the reasons why people might not be getting the images that they're after, is I think a lot of times people think they're getting low, but they're not actually that low.
You're saying you can always go a little bit lower.
Totally, totally. I mean, you have to weigh the risks, right? Especially if you're in the pond, and obviously you have to listen to your body and what you can, what it can do. But ultimately, the goal to have your image sensor lined up with the bird's eye. So if it's a small little duck swimming across the pond, that means you want your lens that high off the water.
But it's not only getting low and dirty, which is not something that I enjoy very much, so I avoid it whenever I can. And oftentimes when I'm working at the beach these days, I actually use one of those screens that I have, like my Atomos Ninja on top of the camera.
Mhm.
Because instead of the screen on the back of the camera, which is too small to sometimes really work on, I can have that bigger screen on top of the camera and I just put the lens foot into the sand and then I have the big screen right on top of the camera. I can really easily move it around. And then I also don't have to lie down or get too wet. So there's actually pretty cheap ones for like $100 that
Hmm.
you can't record on, like on my screen, but you can
Okay.
still use it as a bigger viewfinder on top. And that definitely helps me to avoid getting into the pond sometimes or getting too wet. But since we're talking about perspective, it's not just being low to birds, low to the ground. The same is true with other birds. Like if you have a bird high up in the tree, it's always helpful if you can find a way to be eye level with that bird as well. It's really about creating that intimacy in your shots, and
Yeah.
being eye level is one of the key features for that. Like these birds of paradise behind me, there was a few different spots where people always went to photograph them, but the main displaying perch was probably 10 meters above everyone and you're shooting straight into the sky. So
Yeah.
it's a cool scene, but all you're getting is like a documentary shot of a bird displaying. It's half covered by the branch. You have a very bright background. So I started to wander around, and eventually I found another branch where I could kind of climb up on a hill and then climb up on a little tree, and suddenly I was able to be a lot more at eye level. So in the end, I was able to create an image that's probably one of my favorite images of all time because I looked around and found a way to get eye level with a bird that usually is only high up in the canopy. And it does make such a huge difference.
Yeah, and one more thing, and I know you talked about this. I think you were photographing some fruit doves, and sometimes you can't physically actually get higher. And the tendency we often have is to try to get closer, but all that does is create a steeper angle to your subject. So if you have a possibility of putting on a teleconverter and actually backing up, it can make it look like you're more eye level. And sometimes the birds will kind of look down a little bit, and then with a distant angle, a shallow angle, and
Yeah.
the right pose, it can actually look at eye level. So all good things to think about next time you're in the field.
Yes, that's a strange but very good tip. The higher the bird, the further away you should be with the longest lens possible to get that really nice, at least feel of eye level. It's not really eye level, but it
Yeah.
ends up looking like eye level. Great tip.
Okay, so for our second tip this week, I think we're going to take a bit of a turn here, not something sort of technical like we just talked about, but something that, is really important as well, and that's being able to find the birds in the first place. Now, we've talked about this a lot in the past on the show, which is one of the best things that any of us can do is to actually become a better birder. So, understanding the birds, understanding their habits, understanding their ecosystems. But there's also some other things we can do, like using the tools like eBird or Facebook birding groups or things like that to try to help us find the birds out there in the first place.
That's definitely important because no one really likes just photographing empty branches. And you brought up these fruit doves, and they're actually the perfect example of that. I always wanted to photograph them. I know they live in my area. I sometimes see them fly past, but I never actually found a spot where I could photograph them. And then suddenly, in one of the many Facebook groups I'm in to stalk locations, I saw someone post pictures of these fruit doves where it looked like they were somewhat high up in the tree, but I felt like if you could step back there, I could probably get a decent shot. So I checked out the location, I got there, and fair enough, there was a bunch of these birds in these palm trees. And what was also key here, though, and I think it's also important, is that I had to have the right conditions to photograph these birds. Like, normally they would only come feeding at certain times of the day. And then to get decent photos, I also needed to have nice overcast light because otherwise, if I didn't have overcast light, I would be way too restricted by the sun angle to be able to walk back up on the hill and get the images I wanted. I would basically be only able to shoot in one direction, and I'd probably get shadows from like the palm leaves hanging over the fruits and onto the birds. So being able to pick the right location, but also then find the right weather is definitely key as well.
So, one really great homework assignment for everybody. I know I did this a lot when I first started getting into birds, and there was a lot of the birds in the field guide that I've never seen before, and I was really hoping to see. And so I would go through, my Birds of North America field guide, and I would sort of see, oh, I really would love to see the black-throated blue warbler. And then I would, go and try to figure out where is that likely to be possible, especially when you're starting out and there's a lot of birds you've never seen or you're not familiar with. Pick a few each season, especially in the spring, and do the homework, do the research, and then go find those birds.
One of the biggest issues I see people having in the field is that they're not familiar enough with the camera and also are not able to get the camera or their viewfinder or lens quick enough on to the bird. I'm sure this is something that you see as well when you lead your workshops, for instance. Oftentimes people fumble around, finally find the bird in the viewfinder, but then the settings are wrong and the bird
Yeah.
is long gone before they actually ever get one well-exposed photo.
Yeah, that's a great point for sure. And I think that one of the most important things to do in the field whenever possible is pre-focusing. So, for
Yeah.
example, if we've left our lens focused out at, 100 meters, and then a bird pops up 5 meters away, and you think, oh, I'm going to see that bird. And you lift your lens. If it's a big telephoto lens, you're not going to see anything. You're just going to see blurred, and you're going to wonder why you don't see the bird, and you're going to start scanning all around. So, especially, whether it's, songbirds, perched birds, or things like that, I'm always, as I'm walking around, I'm trying to kind of pre-focus to sort of guess approximately what's the distance I'm going to photograph this bird at. And this is really important too for birds in flight. Because
Yeah.
if you think birds, let's say they're flying from this direction that way, and I think, okay, my sweet spot for the light angles here, well, I don't want to pick the bird up here. I want to pick the bird up way over there. So I'm going to pre-focus on something, whether it's just a log on the beach or an iceberg floating by or whatever. And so that when I do see a bird flying and I lift my camera, I'm approximately at the right distance so that when I can actually see the shape of the bird, hit the focus button, and then I have a good chance. So pre-focusing, I think, is a critical step in the field.
Definitely. And this is especially important with mirrorless cameras as well, because it's harder for them to sort of tell the distance between different subjects you want to focus
Definitely.
on. So if you're focused out too far or the bird's completely out of focus, oftentimes the camera can't find it or it gets stuck on the background and you see the bird beautifully large in your viewfinder, but it's completely out of focus and the camera just doesn't want to jump on it. So in this case, if you actually focus even a little bit closer than where you want the bird to be, then the camera doesn't have a hard time usually jumping right onto it. So the clearer it is for you in the viewfinder, the easier it is also for the camera to focus on what you want to focus on. So as you say, pre-focusing is key.
Yeah. I think we could sum this up as like it's kind of like the skill involved here is almost like focal plane management. So managing where your focal plane is will really help you to be able to see the bird better and then get on it better. And the other critical skill in the field, which I do think is truly a skill, is what I would call eye lens coordination. So I see a bird, he's flying, and I can lift my 600 millimeter lens and, you know, 9 times out of 10, as soon as I put it on my eye, the bird's right where I expect it to be.
Yeah.
But of course, that takes practice. And when people are just starting out, especially if they've not worked their way up through like shorter focal lengths, and they just go out right away and buy a big 800 millimeter f11 or whatever, and they're just wondering where's the bird, and they're struggling so much. So practicing can be really helpful, even if you're just in your backyard and you just sort of, you know, you put your watering can somewhere and you put, you know, something else here. You have some little targets that you can practice on. These things can really help.
And I think another mistake people make when it comes to pre-focusing is that they think that they always need to focus on the bird. For instance, if I'm photographing at a setup and there's one distant perch and one close perch, I'll never try to wait for the bird to land on the close perch and then try to focus on the bird. I usually pick a different spot, maybe the base of the tree, that I can quickly focus on, that I know the camera will focus on quickly as well. Rather than trying to find the bird and then telling the camera focus on this little gray thing, you can focus on the tree first, then move over to the bird, and it's basically already in focus for you, and it makes it much easier.
Absolutely. Now, another thing when it comes to, obviously we're taking pictures, like we got the bird in focus, we've got him there, but that doesn't mean we necessarily have all the ingredients for a great photo, does it? We still need to expose the bird properly, and depending on the techniques you use and how you're thinking about things, you may or may not have the right exposure right out of the gate. So what are some things people can do to try to improve their odds of having correct exposures in the field?
First of all, I think it's important that you become very familiar with how your camera works and that it's second nature to you to just change any buttons, especially the exposure, without even looking at the camera body. And now with mirrorless cameras, it has become quite easy because we can have the histogram in the viewfinder, we have the exposure simulation in the viewfinder. So it's actually very easy to quickly look at the scene and then make a couple adjustments to try and get the exposure in a good range. It doesn't have to be perfect every single time. Sometimes we underexpose, sometimes we overexpose, but we want to stay within a range where it's recoverable. So ultimately what it comes down to is knowing how to control your gear and sort of planning out in your head what is going to happen before the birds even come in. If I'm on a cliff and I'm waiting for an osprey to shoot around the corner, this is exactly what I'm preparing for. I pre-focus on that corner, for instance, and when I see the bird, I have the right settings dialed in. I know the bird's going to fly this way, and I rip up the camera and I'm trying to get the shot. So playing over and over in your mind what will happen. I usually have some go-to settings in the field. I know light changes, but you probably have some sort of settings you feel like are usually quite good for bird photography as well. If I'm photographing birds in flight, for instance, I always try to have over like a 4,000th of a second to make sure that I freeze all the action. And if it's an overcast day, I know that I like to have probably ISO 30 to 100 and at least like a 400th of a second to give me a decent enough shutter speed in these sort of darker conditions. Do you have any go-to settings?
A lot of times when I'm teaching workshops, people are like, what should my settings be? And I'm kind of like, well, I don't even have my camera with me. You guys need to like look at the subject and see, like, take a picture of the perch. You know, what shutter speed are you getting? Is that going to be adequate if you're just getting the bird and he's sitting there, or if it's a really fast little tanager jumping around? So the action and the subject sort of dictates, you know, what we would need. And oftentimes it's dictated by the shutter speed. So depending on how much movement is happening, that will probably tell us where we need to float our ISOs. But yeah, sometimes, you know, if you know you're going into the dark forest right away, you're going to crank that ISO up and get ready. A lot of it's just about being ready for what's about to come and predicting the action.
And you might wonder as well, what can I do to find the right exposure if the bird's not there? Well, you can basically plan out in your head as well, or remember what sort of color is the bird, and then just find a similar color somewhere around you, and then just focus on that and try to get the exposure. For instance, when I tried to photograph the ospreys on a cliff, I just focus on the waves and make sure that where the waves are sort of crashing, I don't blow out the highlights because that's very similar brightness to the brightest areas on the osprey, for instance. Or if you have a little brown bird in the forest, you can, for instance, just set your exposure to a similar colored tree trunk. So there's really no reason not to be ready when the bird's showing up.
Absolutely. So, in summary, this third point is all about being ready for action, whether it's pre focusing in the right area, being ready with the right settings, and being ready up here too, predicting what's going to happen. All of those things are going to lead to better photos.
And once you've mastered all these steps, it's actually time to take it up another level and also forget about the bird when you're photographing. Or not totally forget about it, but not be totally consumed by the bird and what the bird is doing. Because this can happen to us in the field and happens to us sometimes as well. Like there is something really exciting happening with a bird that we really wanted to photograph for a long time. And so you kind of get carried away. You feel like if I move, I might lose it. But oftentimes just moving a couple of steps to the left or to the right or go higher or lower can create you a much better image. And at a certain stage in your career, you will get to the point where you're kind of cool enough to see past the bird and see everything else that's happening in your frame as well. And that can really help you to create some more unique kind of photos.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think when you first start out, you're just happy to have a sharp, in focus, properly exposed bird, even if the bird's sitting on a chain link fence with somebody's house in the background, right? So all of these other elements ultimately they're almost equally as important as the bird, I would say, because the bird is obviously the star of the show, but if you don't have the surrounding kind of elements, you can never actually achieve a really great bird photo, even if the bird is perfect.
And this is something we see a lot in the photos of the week as well, right? We often say, look, there was this one black dot in the background. If you probably just went a little bit higher or a little bit to the left, you could have eliminated that. And this is definitely something that will help you in editing your photos as well and cut down on the time that you need to edit your photos if you try to get it as perfect as possible in camera. Of course, we need editing as well, and that's what we're going to talk about in the tweak of the week now. But getting it as perfect in camera is obviously the main goal, isn't it?
I really like images in flat light, but they do require often more processing,
Yeah.
but they can ultimately, you have maybe more of a blank canvas to sort of control how you want the image to ultimately look. And what you don't really want to shoot in is like really harsh light. I'll see people out shooting and it's like midday and the sun is up high, and there's no recipe out here for great photos right now. It's better off to just go take a break and then wait for the good light and get back out there again.
Because sometimes the light might even still be acceptable, especially if it's a winter time you're shooting in the middle of the day, you might get away with it. But then you often still deal with things like heat haze that are just inevitable during a day. So you might get an image that looks okay, but you zoom into and it's really not sharp. But there's nothing wrong with your gear or you. It's just the wrong time of the day, and you just
Totally.
cannot sometimes get an image at certain times of the day.
Heat haze has to be one of the most frustrating things as a bird photographer because it's often unpredictable. Like it's not like, oh, the hottest time of day, that's when there's going to be heat. It's not like that. Very unpredictable and, often unexpected. And often you don't notice it until you get home and you start looking through your images and you just realize, I mean, sometimes it's super obvious, but sometimes it's just subtle and there's really not that much you can do about it if it's really bad. And it can be real frustrating.
And here's a dead giveaway if you're not sure whether your lens is broken or you are dealing with heat haze. If you zoom into the bird's eye and you look at the sun reflection in the bird's eye, if it's a round, clear shape, it's not heat haze. Whenever you sort of see the sun reflection being like jagged or not very round, it's usually a dead giveaway that you're dealing at least with some sort of heat haze.
Okay, well, we've been talking now about editing, so I think it's time we segue here into the tweak of the week. Hopefully, you found those first four tips useful, and those will help you to get some great photos. This week, I thought a good one that we could share, a good tweak of the week would be, something again that we see a lot of in our photos of the week. Very common that we sort of say like, oh, it could have just been a bit brighter. The reason that we see that over and over and over again is that people aren't totally in control of basically layer masking, being able to brighten the overall image, but still hold on to the brightest parts of the image. And that's what we're going to show you in this week's tweak of the week.
Definitely, if you only make basically global adjustments to your photo, it's very hard to get it to the point where it should be because we have dark areas, we have bright areas, and holding on to the details in the dark areas, but also in the bright areas can be quite tricky. And ultimately, what we want to do with image editing is basically to expand the dynamic range in our images. So we
Exactly.
have detail in the dark areas and detail in the bright areas. And the only way to really do that is with selective editing, and that can be with masking in Lightroom, for instance, that can be with layer masking in Photoshop, but making these selective adjustments is key. And there's one more thing before I throw it back to you. If your screen is too bright and not calibrated, this can also be a reason that your images are too dark. Having a decent screen and also not making it too bright. For instance, if I'm just editing on my MacBook Pro, I usually have it only like 2/3 up when it comes to the brightness, because I feel like if I make it any brighter, I'm always tempted to not make the image bright enough because then it starts to feel a little bit too bright on my screen.
Usually what I wind up doing in Adobe Camera Raw is trying to get it overall looking pretty good, maybe not perfect, knowing that I'm going to do some more selective editing once I get into Photoshop. So get the raw looking as good as you can using the tools available, and then once I move into Photoshop, we can see here that overall the image is still too dark. So I can go in, I can make a second layer, I can then you could do a curves adjustment, or in this case, I used a levels adjustment, and I can really brighten up the image. And I know if I hold down the Alt or the Option key while I'm clicking on the white point, that I can see what's getting blown out. So I can see exactly what I'm going to need to layer mask back to the original brightness. So in this way, I can make the overall image quite a bit brighter, and then I can simply go back in and paint over the areas that got too bright and mask those back to how they were. So that's a way, and I think that's what we see a lot in these photos of the week, where if people had that one critical skill, just that ability to use a levels adjustment layer and then to mask the bright areas back, that I think would solve a lot of the problems that we often see in the photo of the week.
That's a great tip and will definitely help. And to me, editing is basically a two-step process. I use the global sliders, whether it's in Lightroom or Camera Raw, to basically balance out the light in the image as much as humanly possible. And I also use our presets to get the colors right, and they help me as well to get the balance in the image right. And once I reach the point that I feel like this is as much as I can do, then I go in and do selective adjustments with either the masking in Lightroom or the layer mask in Photoshop. Make a selection of the subject so I can darken or brighten certain areas. Or as you say, if the whole image is still a little bit dark, I can then hold on to the white area by bringing it back and brightening the rest of the image.
Yeah, no, those are great tips. And just one more little thing before we finish with this beautiful Pacific Loom, working our way through the general global adjustments, the local adjustments. But at the end there, I still felt like there was work to be done here. And this is where some of the tools in our brush pack really came in helpful. So here, for example, on the breast, you can really see that there's a strong blue cast. And we've been talking about this a lot with other people's images lately on the photo of the week. So I could simply use our cleanup whites brush to brush that back out and to make the whites truly white. I could use the mid-tone adjustments to brush to work over the body and make it just a little bit darker, the overall body, and then a little bit of saturation as well on the bird's neck and eye.
These selective adjustments are really key to making your images look amazing and transform them into like real masterpieces. And if you guys want to learn all about image editing and become more confident and get the best out of your own photos, make sure to check out our presets, the brush pack, my masterclass and Glenn's ebook down there in the description to help you on your way to perfect images.
Well, speaking of perfect images, Jan, I bet you there's a few pretty good ones in our photo of the week. So why don't we move on and look at some of those great shots?
Let's see. The first image I brought is from Eric Patu, and it's of this Gambel's quail, I assume taken somewhere in the southern United States most likely. And I thought it's a really nice image, but also a great example where some more selective editing could probably improve the image a lot. Looking at this image, I feel like we could try to put a bit more emphasis on the bird and take a little bit of that power away from the background, especially the right-hand side is pretty bright. And then at the very least, I feel like the perch and the background have a bit of a sort of cool blue cast as well. Overall, I feel like you could warm up the image a bit, pull out the saturation out of the perch. I think that will help in cleaning up the image as well. And I would also work on the bird's eye because I feel like currently we can't really see that at all.
It looks like probably the background is maybe like a bunch of cactuses or something
Yeah.
that are catching some light. And so you have these, not only do you have the bright area, but you also have these kind of, fairly vertical lines. So I would
Mm,
probably try to kind of clean those up a little bit so that they're not such a linear form in the background. And then I agree
yeah.
with you too. There's the bird's probably too magenta or too cool. And if we did a bunch of those things, I think this image could be, from here just up a couple points. It's a nice shot, but this sort of falls into that category of where the bird looks great, but there's these other elements that we need to work on, especially the background and the overall kind of, there's a little bit of editing tweaks. All right, so my first image this week is by Cochrane DWC, and it's of this beautiful ringneck duck. And I picked this one because I knew one of our tips was about getting low, getting that eye level perspective. So I think this is a good example. You can tell this was shot from a very low perspective because you can see the distant side of the pond. You can see the shoreline on the distant side, and you see that really razor thin sort of depth of field. The bird's head is completely clearing the little ripples in the pond. And so in behind it is just nicely soft, out of focus water. So just a good example, I think, of getting that low perspective and how that can really benefit the shot.
And I think here they did well not being too low because sometimes I see people being obsessed with being super, super low. But what then happens is the shoreline is cutting right through the bird's
Mm,
head. And I think in this
yep.
case, it's actually better to be ever so slightly higher up so that the bird doesn't intersect with the shoreline. In this case here, I think this is very well done.
So Jan, what's your next shot?
My next image is of this really cool looking redneck goose taken in the Netherlands by a photograph, and it's an awesome bird. It's making a great pose, but I'm kind of conflicted about this photo because I want it to be so amazing, but especially those two lines of sort of little grassy, muddy bits or whatever are really throwing me off. So I'm kind of lost at what I would like to do to this photo. I can see by the crop that they tried very hard to keep these other geese into the photo, but at the end of the day, we might have to ask ourselves, do they add anything to the picture? And now it
Yeah.
would come down to me as well, what camera was used. If this is quite full frame and this was like a 50 megapixel camera, for instance, I'd be very tempted to say, let's get right in there, crop away some of the
Hmm.
mess, and then maybe remove some of the mess and have a cleaner image with the goose much larger. If this was a 24 megapixel camera and this is already cropped, then we might not be able to do much about it. But I feel like looking at it now, the one thing I would definitely do is remove that big dark cluster of grass right near the bird's head. If that was gone, I think it would already be a stronger image. And there's also a couple dark areas sort of right above the back that I might remove as well, trying to make that main hero of the shot the actual hero.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think no matter what, I would crop this way tighter, and that will eliminate a lot of that upper stuff. It's such a cool species, and I assume it's not a, I don't think it's a common bird
No, it'd
in
be
the
very
Netherlands
rare to
either. I
see
think,
it there. So
yeah.
it's you can't do much about it. It's not like they're just everywhere and you just crawl up and they walk through these little flowers. So there's probably one within a flock of a lot of other geese.
And just before we move on to my next image here, just, coming back to our four main tips this week,
Yeah.
and one of them was to get that eye level perspective. Well, I feel like this was definitely shot down on the bird, right? So knowing that we have this kind of not ideal setting, we ideally would have gotten lower and tried to kind of line up a more distant, pleasing background. If we had a really shallow focal plane, whenever, sometimes you're shooting, like I find sometimes with like night jars and stuff, they land on the road and it's just like a gravelly road or something.
Yeah.
It doesn't actually look that nice of a setting. But if you get really low and all it is, literally 1 centimeter that's in focus, at least the depth of field helps to blur out these undesired objects. So
Yeah.
one more reason to get down low.
So in this case, maybe it was not possible because knowing the Netherlands, there might be a little bit of a creek or dam between you and the birds. There might
Mm.
be reeds sticking out, so you have to
Or
stick with
somebody
the
riding a
higher angle.
bicycle.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Not stereotyping anyone here, but definitely the lowest possible will help a lot here to get a nicer looking background. So what's your next image, Glenn?
Well, my next one is of these beautiful two drake pintails flying. I really like the poses, having one wings up, one wings down, one slightly in front of the other one. All those are great things. But, well, let's play our fun game, Jan. What do you think I might like to change about this image to make it just that little bit more appealing?
Well, I actually worked on one of the pintails for my Lightroom masterclass, and it had one of the similar issues that the chest was really, really orange from the water that it
Mm,
was swimming in. So I think this is one thing that throws me off a little bit in this image because it's not natural for the ducks to be so bright and orange. So this could have
mhm,
happened, for instance, if you crank up the vibrance or the saturation to make the overall image look nicer, make the sky bluer, that you also crank up the orange in the bird's chest. So you could go in, for
could
instance,
be, yeah.
with the point color, pull that out a little bit, or find other ways to desaturate that. Use our
Mhm.
desaturate colors
Use the
brush and
brush
just
pack.
brush that out. And then I feel like there's also a lot of very warm light kicking around on the bird's wings and stuff. So I might be tempted to just remove some of the saturation on the gray areas of the birds as well. And then just looking at the image, it feels like it's a little bit dark in a way. You almost feel like you could brighten the midtones in this image. Not so much the blacks or
Mhm.
the highlights, but if you go to the histogram, for instance, or the levels, and then move the midtones up, it might help the image to level it out a little bit and make it overall a bit brighter without making it too bright. Because here the sun angle was also challenging because the bird's wings are kind of creating a shadow on their own body.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I actually think it's the overall image is just simply too dark. It's just another example of our from our tweak of the week where, when I look at this, I don't see anything really that looks truly white. And some of the backs of those primary feathers and certainly parts of the bird's neck should be white. So I would definitely make an adjustment layer, brighten it up. I would pinch in the white point until I saw those bits of the white neck and the back of the leading bird's primaries blowing out, and then also maybe raise the midtones a bit, and then go in and mask that back out and then see how it looks. But I think the overall image needs to be brighter is the main thing for me, and yeah, some color tonalities as well. But overall, the raw ingredients are here to get a great final product.
My last image is of this Quetzal by Prasheen Gopal, and that has to be the hardest bird to frame, I reckon.
It's one of them,
Especially on these setups. I assume this is a setup because I've
for
seen
sure.
these setups before. It looks like sort of a T. You have one pole up and then you have this long branch. And I think in this case, this actually makes it incredibly hard to actually frame this bird. I think if you actually set up an upright perch, this would make it much easier to make a nice, pleasant image of this bird. Because at the moment, what I'm always challenged with is if the perch and the bird kind of create a cross, like it makes it hard to have a really
Mhm.
nice flow in the image because the perch is so horizontal, but then the bird is so upright. So it's a
Yeah.
great image of a stunning bird. They also did a good job working on the background because the bird's so big. They have to shoot from quite far away, so the background probably always becomes an issue as well.
This is a bird that doesn't lend itself to this kind of a setup.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's such a spectacular bird, and I almost want to zoom in more to appreciate it more. So sometimes I've seen images where the tail is cropped off, and it
Mhm.
almost looks better than having these images with the tail in. And that's what I was saying before. If you had an upright perch, you might be able to have the tail sort of coming around it and the bird a bit larger in the frame. Because whenever I look at these images, and there's a lot of Quetzal images on Instagram, it always feels like the framing is a bit off. Like I want to be
Mhm.
closer to the bird, but then you can't be closer to the bird because the tail is so long.
So just a few things to consider there, especially for those subjects that have something that's really out of proportion, whether it's a sword-billed hummingbird or a resplendent quetzal or a pintail or a long-tailed sylph. These birds that have these crazy long tails or bills or something often need a different approach.
And I didn't want to be negative here because it's a stunning photo, very well edited of a stunning bird. But looking at it, I sometimes feel like what else could be done to maybe get this
Yeah.
bird bigger in the frame?
All right, so my last image this week is of this really cool woodpecker by Ankit Schutz. And this is one where definitely I picked because I just think it's such a cool species. I think it's a flame crest. I'd love to see some of these woodpeckers someday from India or wherever this guy's from. But a pretty cool kind of gnarly vertical perch, and the bird went up to the top of it. I definitely wish the bird had given a little bit of a head turn. It sort of feels like it's looking away from the
Yeah.
camera, and maybe could pull a little more detail out of the yellow crest there. But overall, I thought it was a really cool image. What did you think about this one, Jan?
Looking at it now, it's definitely very cool. It lifts from the awesome colors in the bird. I agree, you definitely have to work on the yellow in the back of the bird. So for instance, you could make a selection of the yellow and then selective color, just pull the sliders around a bit, or you can use the Nick collection, the detail extractor, trying to get a bit more details out of it, or just desaturate it a bit. This can often help as well to just get a bit more detail in the section. Maybe just darken it down a little bit with one of our darken down brushes or curves layer in Photoshop. Then you already mentioned a head turn. I think we definitely need a head turn. That would help a lot. And then I just wonder if you could work on the bird's beak a little bit as well. I don't know if it's dirty, but there's lots of sort of white lines and white sort of stuff going around. So I feel like if you darken that down, you might be able to make it a little bit stronger, because at the moment it sort of feels like it's looking away a bit and the beak's kind of a bit sort of mushy white as well, where I feel like if you darken that down, it could make it a little bit stronger as well.
You know, now that I look at this image closer and I see that same kind of white stuff around the top of the perch, I actually think this is a setup where there was food in the top of that perch there and the bird's eating it.
Possible.
So if that is the case, then I would probably want to try to clean up some of the white, whatever, if it's suet or I'm not sure what's in there. And
Yeah.
as you say, maybe some of it on the bill as well. Because whenever you're doing a setup with food that's not like necessarily what this bird would naturally eat, you don't want to see any of that in the final image. Like whether you see suet on a bird's
Yeah.
bill or peanut butter or like a big peanut in a shell, usually those are kind of, you'd want to kind of get those out of the shot, I think. What I love about the pose, I don't like the head turn, but what I do like is the fact that the bird is so isolated. And whenever I'm shooting woodpeckers or flickers or sapsuckers, I love it when I can see space between the bird's body
Yeah.
and the perch. It tells me that I'm very perpendicular and it really sets them off against the perch, and you can see all those nice under feathers. So that's great. Maybe you have another one with a better head turn.
And on that note, I think it's time for us now to turn our heads away from the camera, finish up this episode. So you guys, please let us know in the comments, what did you think of this episode? Did you find our tips helpful? Did we miss an important tip? Let us know. Give us a thumbs up for the video. Hit that subscribe button, and we will see you guys in another video very soon. Bye.
See you next time, everybody.